What's the matter, George? Are the Hollywood roles getting a little hard to come by as you age and get decidedly more smug and self-congratulatory? I'm just asking. And chooses to finish this show by lecturing the audience on how journalism ought to be done. Speaking as Edward R. Murrow, he warns about the ongoing struggle for truth and integrity in the media. Truth and integrity. About the potential for the media to be manipulated and used for propaganda.
Imagine Hollywood's most impeccably polished star, a man whose very name conjures images of suave sophistication, effortless charm, and an almost mythical aura of untouchable wisdom. For decades, he's been the epitome of cool, the silver-haired fox who navigates red carpets with a practiced smirk, captivating audiences with every perfectly delivered line. He's the one who seemed to have it all: the fame, the fortune, the seemingly flawless moral compass. He's played iconic roles, directed critically acclaimed films, and effortlessly transitioned from one philanthropic cause to the next, always with that knowing twinkle in his eye, as if he held the secrets to the universe in his perfectly moisturized hands. He's been celebrated, adored, and perhaps overly indulged, perpetually surrounded by an echo chamber of adulation that reinforced his belief in his own infallible judgment. But what happens when that meticulously crafted facade cracks? What happens when the man everyone expected to deliver profound insights instead delivers a public performance so staggeringly misjudged it leads to a meltdown? Not on a movie set, but on live television, under the unforgiving glare of the global spotlight, where his carefully constructed persona shatters into a million pieces. This isn't a scripted drama. This is the very real, very public saga of George Clooney, and the moment he discovered that even Hollywood gods can fall, perhaps even to the point of utter, undeniable humiliation.
Wow, if that's Clooney with makeup, imagine what he looks like without it, huh? Now remember, Clooney's the same guy who held a star-studded fundraiser for Joe weeks before he dropped out and only called for him to quit after his disastrous debate. Clooney ignored concerns over Biden's age for years, only to magically come to the conclusion that he was demented when America finally saw what Clooney had been hiding. That's the problem with Dems. They're obedient shills for awful people, then pretend otherwise once voters see that they're full of. But remember, we were pointing out Joe's dementia before it was cool. We knew Biden was the worst president ever, which probably means Jimmy Carter died a happy man.
For what felt like an eternity, George Clooney has cultivated this aura of effortless perfection, a man who seemed to glide through life with a permanent Oscar-winning smile and a perpetual air of moral righteousness. He's the Hollywood darling, who once played Batman, not like a gritty, tormented superhero, but as if modeling high-end Italian suits at a funeral for Gotham's underworld. Now he's exploded back into the headlines, not for his acting prowess or directing flair, but for injecting himself once again into the tumultuous political discourse. It's almost as if he genuinely believed the entire world was clamoring for the geopolitical insights of an espresso mascot. His latest public gambit saw him choose to cap off an appearance by lecturing the audience on the supposed sanctity of journalism itself, warning direly about the insidious potential for media manipulation and the ongoing noble struggle for truth and integrity. The irony for many was not just palpable, it was a blaring neon sign illuminating a perceived chasm between his words and his own track record. One might be tempted to ask, with all due respect, what exactly qualifies him to be the arbiter of journalistic ethics, particularly when his own public statements have, on occasion, been riddled with a curious sort of selective timing.
Tonight we check in with the poor man's Greg Gutfeld, George Clooney. Remember, he wrote a scathing op-ed prior to the election calling on Joe Biden to drop out? And this week he took to CNN, the only place he's seen less than in his own movies, to gloat. God, I hope Jake Tapper doesn't plant his lips firmly on George's puckered ass.
Julia Roberts, who outed herself not only as a leftist, which we knew, but as somebody who... And by the way, she's also a husband stealer. She stole the husband that she has right now in a reported affair. So, okay, maybe don't be the voice of the ad in which we talk about women betraying their husbands, because in the leftist view, marriages are not about honesty and talking about one's differences and agreeing to disagree on certain dicey issues. but they're about lying. And they believe this so strongly, you put it in an ad. And her pal, George Clooney, who did something similar for another ad, same. You got Joe Biden out. How'd it work out for you? How'd that go? Maybe you should have said something a little earlier, like when you attended that fundraiser.
The man who now pontificates on media ethics with such solemnity is the same figure who, mere weeks before Joe Biden's dramatic withdrawal from the presidential race, hosted a lavish, star-studded fundraiser for him. Here's where the story takes a peculiar turn. Clooney only publicly called for Biden to step aside after his widely scrutinized and by many accounts disastrous debate performance. For years, the concerns surrounding Biden's age, his perceived gaffes, and his overall decline were conveniently sidestepped, even dismissed by Clooney and his Hollywood coterie. They seem to possess an almost magical ability to ignore mounting evidence. Yet, almost as if by divine revelation, Clooney suddenly came to the truth that Biden was unfit, but only when America, through the unforgiving lens of live television, finally saw what, some speculate, Clooney and his inner circle had been deliberately overlooking, perhaps even actively concealing for months or even years. This wasn't just a political misstep. It began to feel like a perfectly orchestrated cosmic setup, a perfect storm brewing over a public figure who, it seemed, had always managed to walk on water, immune to the usual rules of accountability. But this carefully constructed invincibility was about to meet its match as a confrontation with formidable, unyielding opponents would soon devastatingly expose.
He waited a long time, but he should have the guts to maybe say that his friends in Hollywood, like John Voight or Mel Gibson or Sylvester Stallone, who shared a risk, might have been right on a few things. He's starring in Glengarry Glen Ross, am I right?
No, it's Good Night and Good Luck.
Oh,
sorry,
never mind.
my fault.
I was gonna say, I mean, they have tremendous respect for David Mamet. David Mamet is one of the most conservative people, so maybe instead of just sitting in silence, you should actually speak up for some of the people who shared the risk in Hollywood.
Fundraiser, where he saw Biden almost falling off the stage, where Obama came out to grab him, was June 15th. The debate was June 27th. It wasn't until July 10th, almost a month after he attended the fundraiser with him, that George Clooney finally wrote that op-ed after it became clear that Joe Biden wasn't stepping down. He's such a liar that he just encountered him at the debate and knew what he had to do.
The stage was indeed set, not for a polite discussion, but for a public pummeling, a rhetorical beatdown that Clooney, by every single account, was utterly and completely unprepared for. He waltzed into the public square, radiating an almost blinding self-assurance, seemingly convinced he was some shimmering oracle of truth, a modern-day Socrates in a designer suit. Instead, he was verbally body slammed by reality itself, or more precisely, by individuals who possess a rare talent for cutting through Hollywood gloss. These are the people who, unlike some of Clooney's fawning fans, don't confuse a chiseled jawline with a sharp intellect, or an expensive cologne with profound wisdom. After getting systematically and ruthlessly steamrolled by the likes of Megyn Kelly and Greg Gutfeld, the usually unflappable Clooney seemed to visibly shrink, his famous swagger deflating, leaving him qualified for little more than a tissue. Sponsorship. It was a confrontation that didn't just pull back the curtain, it ripped it down, revealing that beneath the perfectly moisturized eyes, the practiced charm, and the carefully cultivated public persona, there was a man utterly flummoxed, even genuinely stunned by a true, unyielding debate. This wasn't a curated TED Talk where he could deliver his smug little monologue to a fawning audience. This was a roast, and Clooney found himself the unexpected and profoundly uncomfortable guest of honor, served a heaping plate of his own hubris.
You know, he's the opposite of radical. But the weird thing is, without a horse to back, do you really know what he believes in? Like, I know what he's against. He's against Trump. But in this new world of common sense, what does he align with? He might have way more in common with Trump than he is with the progressives. The question is, does he have the bravery to say that? I have no idea where he stands on the border, sanctuary cities, or trans extremism. How does he feel about the fires in LA? Is he happy with how it was handled by Mayor What's-Her-Face and Governor who's his name? You know,
here he is going on, this is to 60 last night, about, you mentioned his op-ed in the New York Times on Joe Biden, and why he did it. Such a selfless, brave act, Ben. Here he was.
I was raised to tell the truth. I had seen the president up close for this fundraiser. And I was surprised. And so I feel as if there was a lot of profiles in cowardice in my party through all of that.
Oh, wow.
And
Adding a thick layer of undeniable irony to the entire spectacle, Clooney's supposed man of the people shtick rings not just hollow, but almost comically absurd when you consider his everyday reality. This is a man who reportedly lectures Middle America, and indeed the world, from the palatial confines of his $100 million Lake Como villa nestled amidst breathtaking Italian scenery. He sips, one can only imagine, imported sparkling water that likely costs more than many people's weekly groceries, all while earnestly pretending to comprehend the very real, often grinding struggles of a gas station attendant in, say, rural Ohio. He likely hasn't set foot inside a Walmart since the original ER was still airing in its prime, yet he grandiosely claims to deeply understand the financial and existential plight of the average Joe and Jane. Nothing screams man of the people, quite like a private jet ride taken solely for the purpose of lecturing hardworking farmers about the complexities of climate change. One might expect him to offer dental hygiene advice from a yacht made entirely of pearls next. This stark, almost cartoonish contrast between his opulent, insulated existence and his public pronouncements on common struggles fuels the most potent criticisms, painting him not just as out of touch, but as profoundly detached. A king on a gilded throne issuing decrees to a world he barely acknowledges, let alone inhabits.
Now, before returning to his exhibit at Madame Tussauds, Clooney opined on the future of the party. I bet there's one person in particular he thinks is spectacular.
there's one person in particular I think is spectacular. There are a few who I think is levitating above that is Wes Moore. I like him a lot. I think he could be someone we could all join in behind. We have to find somebody rather soon. It's our job now to put together a proper team to stand up, because we're right now polling very poorly.
I love that. Levitating above, as opposed to sinking to the bottom, like his last movie.
New nuggets are breaking. Tara Palmieri, who's got her own Substack and podcast now, she's been on the show, she got a copy and released a couple of the nuggets, and so did The Guardian. But hers was a really interesting nugget. And she's apparently in this book, they reveal that George Clooney saw Morning Joe one day, right after his op-ed, and Mika Brzezinski was suggesting that Barack Obama was behind the George Clooney op-ed. That was basically making Clooney seem like Obama's puppet. Yeah. Here's the Mika clip.
The whispers surrounding Clooney's sudden, and some might say strategically timed, political intervention grew louder, particularly in the aftermath of his op-ed calling for Biden to drop out. Fingers began to point not just at Clooney himself, but at unseen puppeteers, with some observers openly speculating that the piece wasn't entirely his own initiative, but rather a carefully orchestrated political maneuver. It was widely reported that Mika Brzezinski, on a segment of Morning Joe, openly speculated that former President Barack Obama was pulling the strings, suggesting Clooney was merely a highly visible, incredibly well-paid puppet in a much larger political game. If this speculation, however unproven, holds even a kernel of truth, it fundamentally transforms Clooney's supposedly brave, selfless act into something far more calculated, a strategic play designed by powerful, shadowy hands. This wasn't just a moment of celebrity self-delusion. It evolved into a complex, intriguing narrative of potential manipulation, where even the most famous faces might simply be delivering lines written by someone else, for someone else's agenda. It raises a fascinating, even unsettling question. How much of Clooney's political persona is genuine conviction, a deep-seated belief in the causes he champions, and how much is merely a meticulously managed performance, a role he's playing just like any other?
I think, there's Johnny come lately, I was raised to be honest, is a bunch of BS. All right. Obama told him to do it. He sees himself as this extremely important person. I think he's an arrogant, condescending, smug individual who thinks that, he should be able to tell people in America, and the Democrat Party certainly, what they should and shouldn't do. This president, Joe Biden, is one of the most disastrous presidents that we've had in American history.
The most exquisitely delicious aspect of Clooney's recent, undeniable public misstep wasn't merely his political stance. glance, but the sheer, almost theatrical cosmic irony of his downfall. It felt to many as if the universe itself had finally, definitively grown weary of his relentlessly performative perfection. For decades, he's effortlessly smirked his way through countless speeches, expecting nothing less than thunderous adulation. Instead, he received a devastating verbal whooping, exquisitely wrapped in biting sarcasm and served with a generous side of public humiliation. Clooney's entire political brand is arguably nothing more than a rich guy's elaborate cosplay of moral superiority. He floats into the scene, blinks his perfectly moisturized eyes with practiced gravitas, and expects everyone to immediately stop what they're doing and listen with rapt attention. Because, well, didn't he once play a brilliant doctor on TV? Forget actual degrees, forget rigorous research, or even simple common sense. George Clooney feels the truth in his very soul, a visceral understanding that transcends mere facts. And if that isn't enough for you, if you dare to question his innate wisdom, then you, by his implicit judgment, must surely be an uncultured swine, incapable of appreciating his profound insights. He seemed genuinely stunned, his eyes wide with a sort of bewildered disbelief that his rugged good looks and charming smile hadn't magically deleted the utterly tone-deaf words he had just uttered. Words so impressively dumb they could have applied for their own reality show. His immediate, visible reaction to the brutal public backlash was, in its own way, a classic Clooney. The furrowed brow of profound concern, the wounded pride flickering in his eyes, and that faint, almost heartbreaking air of disbelief, as if he simply couldn't process the utterly novel idea that someone somewhere might not consider him a walking embodiment of virtue and cinematic gravitas. He looked, to put it mildly, like a substitute teacher who had just realized mid-lesson that the notoriously unruly kids in the back row were definitively not impressed by his painstakingly chosen sweater vest and his outdated VHS tapes. Suddenly, the man who had ascended in his own mind, like Zeus descending from Olympus to bestow wisdom upon the mortals, was getting dunked on relentlessly like a hapless junior varsity mascot. His response wasn't an argument, it wasn't a reasoned counterpoint. It was unmistakably an emotional performance. Every single sentence sounded as if it were being delivered by someone who had just read a particularly moving, tear-jerking poem about the plight of orphaned dolphins, complete with a trembling voice and an almost imperceptible catch in his throat. He could have been talking about municipal traffic laws, and you would swear he was reliving the devastating fall of ancient Rome. Such was the profound, breathy sincerity, the dramatic pauses, and that peculiar practiced head tilt, as if he were constantly posing for a black and white cologne advertisement. This isn't just an actor, it's a full-blown existential tantrum, exquisitely dressed up as concerned commentary, a public meltdown disguised as a moment of profound introspection. Clooney's recent highly public humbling wasn't ultimately about left or right politics. It was a deeply tragicomic spectacle, a masterclass in unintentional self-parody. For decades, he has been systematically told, in every interview, every gala, every adoring review, that he is the smartest, the hottest, the most effortlessly perfect man in any given room. Now, he finally faced a crowd that didn't just fail to be charmed, they didn't even bat an eye at his sexiest man alive trophies, which in Hollywood are practically divine artifacts. For once, George Clooney wasn't the leading man, delivering the heroic lines to thunderous applause. Instead, he was the hapless understudy who had forgotten his lines, stumbled badly, and was sent off stage with a polite but undeniably firm "thanks, but no thanks." It's precisely like watching someone who has been miraculously handed every single coveted role since the golden age of ER suddenly devastatingly realize that charisma, no matter how potent, doesn't automatically come with the script, nor does it magically provide answers to complex societal issues. Clooney walked into this debate, this public forum, expecting nothing less than a thunderous standing ovation, a chorus of adoring voices echoing his pronouncements. Instead, what he got was a full-on public mic drop, a resounding silence that spoke volumes, followed by the digital equivalent of a collective eye roll. You could almost hear the universe chuckling, a deep, resonant cosmic laugh, as the man who once famously played Batman, the embodiment of urban gravitas, discovered in excruciating real time that genuine real-world gravitas isn't something you can fake with perfectly tousled hair and an Oscar smile. That, my friends, is the real comedy gold. Watching George Clooney learn in front of millions that fame doesn't automatically equate to wisdom, and sometimes, just sometimes, the unforgiving spotlight exposes you for exactly who you are. guy who genuinely believed he was playing the hero, but was, in a brutal twist of fate, actually cast as the punchline.